Okay. Late last April, the Texas Supreme Court issued a decision that we had been waiting for around 11 years, basically, to tell us what off-premise outdoor advertising signs are for purposes of right-of-way acquisition. Are they real property that have to be paid for? Or are they movable personal property for which we may have an obligation to pay relocation expenses, but not pay for the sign itself? To those of you who are in San Marcos for the International Right-of-Way Association San Marcos Eminent Domain Conference in September, this is the same presentation that I gave. However, the upside is it's only half as long as it was in September. So a little bit of a historical background. Prior to about 2004, TxDOT treated outdoor advertising signs, and we're not talking about signs that are on a property advertising a business there. Those are called on-premise signs. We're talking about the Clear Channel, Viacom, those people that erect outdoor advertising signs on a sign site that they either lease, have an easement on, or have purchased themselves. And then they sell advertising and rotate the poster boards on the sign. A very profitable business indeed. Prior to 2004, TxDOT essentially allowed a property owner to elect, an outdoor advertising sign owner to elect how they wanted the sign to be treated. And they could either treat it as, they could elect to have it treated as personal property and move it, which they frequently did, or they could opt to have it treated as a real estate fixture. And in that event, TxDOT had an outdoor advertising valuation, what was the proper term? A chart, basically, that had been promulgated with a schedule, it's called, outdoor advertising sign schedule, that had been developed in conjunction with the outdoor advertising industry. And it fixed a sum of money depending on the type of sign, the size of the sign, the age of the sign, and those kinds of things. So there wasn't really a valuation process. And pretty much things kind of rocked along. But in the late 90s, or actually in the several decades preceding 2004, local governments began severely restricting the erection and relocation of outdoor advertising sign structures. In some cities, they were banned altogether. In Houston, they weren't banned, but they were strictly regulated. With the result that for a number of years in the late 90s and the early 2000s, outdoor advertising sign companies in condemnation cases would contend that their sign was worth anywhere from $300,000 to $2 million. And the way they would come to a value is they would use the gross advertising revenues generated by the sign and apply some kind of multiplier to it. So it might be $300,000 a year in gross advertising revenues times a factor, a gross rent multiplier of 6, for a figure of what, $1.8 million for the sign. So kind of maybe as a pushback, and because the issue had been unsettled, TxDOT in 2004 changed its policy whereby henceforth it was going to treat all outdoor advertising structures as personal property and offer relocation benefits, and so appraisers were instructed. In this particular case arose in Houston on the Interstate 10 project, on Interstate 10 inside Loop 610 West. And this particular sign was displaced by the highway project. It was within the area to be acquired for the expansion of the highway. It was two 48 by 14 foot billboard structures in a V formation so they could be seen from by traffic traveling both directions. Each of them were attached to 6 wooden poles that were deeply embedded in the ground, or more accurately in a concrete foundation deeply embedded in the ground, sufficient to withstand wind loads up to hurricane force winds. Not a very pretty sign, but there are the 6 wooden poles buried in the ground. A very profitable sign in a very visible and high traffic location. The factual background is that in Houston, advertising signs are the subject of the City of Houston Sign Code. And as I said before, although it didn't strictly prohibit the relocation of signs, it applied some factors that led Clear Channel to believe that they did not want to relocate these signs. Per that sign code, if a sign was displaced by a road project, however, there was an exception to more stringent regulation, and it could be relocated by special permit within the city limits or outside of the city limits. However, the sign ordinance placed very restrictive spacing and proximity requirements and height and size limitations, such that in this particular case and many other cases, the sign actually had to be downsized to a lesser height and a lesser size. More importantly, the special permit, if it was requested by the sign company and issued by the city, extended for only a 10-year period of time, during which time the sign company could amortize some or all of the costs of the sign. But at the end of the 10-year period, the sign structures had to be taken down at the expense of the sign owner without any compensation by the city. So they got to relocate their sign for 10 years, and then that was it. The sign was gone. This was Houston's way of trying to accommodate TxDOT and provide the landowner some relief without strictly prohibiting the relocation of the signs. The procedural posture of the case is kind of important because it's a little bit unusual. We acquired through our power of eminent domain the land who was actually on which the signs were located. Clear Channel had leased a sign site from the landowner, and we acquired all of the fee interests, all of the ownership interests of the landowner in the case. However, and at the time we did that, it was agreed that Clear Channel, if Clear Channel had any claim for compensation, that it was included in the amount of money we paid to the landowner. Actually, we paid jointly to the landowner and Clear Channel. What that means is if Clear Channel showed that they had a very advantageous lease and were paying below market rentals for that sign site, it may have had a value that they could have sold to another sign company in the market. And that increment of value, if any they could prove, would come out of the amount of money that we paid the landowner and Clear Channel jointly. So all of the issues relating to the land or Clear Channel's leasehold interest in the land were settled out by eminent domain, such that the only remaining issues in the case was the sign itself, and more specifically, what is the character of this particular outdoor advertising sign? Is it as movable personal property as TxDOT had treated them for about a decade, or is it real property? And if it's a real property fixture, how do you go about valuing an outdoor advertising sign for purposes of compensating the sign owner in the eminent domain proceeding? What the court held is that usually, but not necessarily always, outdoor advertising signs are real property fixtures, not personal property, unless they have some indication that they can be moved or that they're portable. So if they're on wheels, they're not a real estate fixture. But applying what was three factors of what an earlier case called the Logan case to the facts of this case, they were found by this court to be real property fixtures. This is my characterization of the holding of the case, not an exact quote, but whether an item of personal property has become a real property fixture depends on whether the hypothetical owner of the undivided fee would have intended the item to become a permanent part of his real property, taking into account the mode and sufficiency of the annexation of the item to the land and the adaptation of the item to the use or purpose of the realty. So that's the three-part Logan test, with the main thing being the intent at the time the item was affixed, whether it would be a movable personal property item or whether it would be transformed by it's being affixed to the land or annexed to the land into a real property fixture. So what the court said is where an item is of such a character that if it was put in by the owner, it would constitute a part of the real estate, then it's to be appraised as real estate. Therefore, the contributory value of a structure which is not portable or easily movable, such as this case, which was firmly embedded in the ground, is to be appraised as a real property fixture to determine the amount of the value that it contributes to the undivided fee. In other words, it's not to be valued, all improvements for eminent domain purposes are to be valued only to the extent it contributes to the value of the land, not separate and apart from the land. And the court said the same is true with outdoor advertising signs when they are real property. The court noted that in this particular case, in order to remove the sign, you would have to essentially destroy the sign. In other words, just because the owner could remove the sign, it would be, the wooden poles would have to be destroyed. They'd have to be chopped up into little pieces in order to get the balance of the sign off there. So in this, thank you. In this instance, the court said it was real property. Just very quickly, the Clear Channel's appraiser at the trial of the case, to show you the difference between how a sign can be valued through one appraisal approach versus the other, is by the cost approach. That is, the cost to reconstruct the sign, then depreciated by a percentage to account for its age and other factors. The Clear Channel's appraisal said $15,000 per sign, or $30,000 for the two signs. However, utilizing advertising revenues, guess what figure he came up with? $692,000. He also used a comparable sales approach, but those sales were not of individual outdoor advertising sign structures. They were actually the sale from one advertising sign company to another of a batch of outdoor advertising signs, along with the business, i.e. the advertising contracts associated with those signs. So the court said income approach using advertising revenues and comparable sales approach using signs of sale plans rather than signs, not good. Going the wrong way. So the court noted, well, this is an unusual case from a procedural perspective because all the land interests had been settled, and so the sign had no choice but to be valued standing alone, contrary to the normal rule. So the court told us in this case the depreciated contributory of the sign structure by way of the cost approach is acceptable in this case, given the peculiar or particular facts of this case. So a separate value of the sign was necessitated, whereas it should otherwise be considered in conjunction with the amount of money or value that it contributes to the land. I keep going backwards. So the main takeaway here in this Clear Channel quote below is that advertising revenues generated by an advertising sign can't be directly considered. We had a case, 5 or 6 years ago, the so-called CISA case, that dealt with this very issue, but it was on how do you value a sign side easement, permanent sign side easement, not the sign structure itself. And in that case, the court said not by using advertising revenues. Now the court in this Clear Channel case said for signs, not by advertising revenues. So the court said, and this is a quote, absent exceptions not applicable here, income from a business operated on the property, including an outdoor advertising business, is not recoverable and should not be included in a condemnation award. The income approach can be used to value the land, but the relevant income is that received by the unified fee owner for the use of the land, i.e. the amount of rentals that are being paid by the sign company to have a lease there. Not the business income generated by the billboard or the operator's profits. So very, very important case. The court told us kind of not what not to do, but they didn't really tell us what you could do. And so it still remains to be seen how outdoor advertising companies are going to approach valuation of outdoor advertising signs in the context of this particular opinion. They can't use advertising revenues, but there's very little doubt they'll be creative in finding some other approaches to maximize the value of signs that are lost to, that are displaced by highway projects. Thank you.